One day, the current war between Ukraine and Russia will end. All wars do. We don't know when the current war between Ukraine and Russia will end, but this week perhaps furnished some idea of how. Last weekend, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine hosted at the Berg resort overlooking Lake Lucerne in Switzerland what he was careful to call the first summit on peace in Ukraine. The foreign desk was present for a conclave which proved more impressive and more constructive than many anticipated. 92 countries turned up, mostly at a head of state and/or government level, a resonant display of solidarity. Zelensky emphasized throughout that Ukraine was not retreating from the 10-point peace formula it proposed in late 2022. This, essentially, and not unreasonably, amounts to a demand that Russia pack up and go home, pay for what it broke, and promise never to try it again. However, the joint communiqué which emerged from the summit focused on 3 of the 10 points, specifically the 3 on which it might be hoped that not even Russia could disagree: nuclear security, food security, and the return home of those taken prisoner, not least thousands of children kidnapped by the occupiers. While there were a few notable absences from the final list of signatories, among them such attendees as India, South Africa, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia, the end result was, at least, an opportunity for Russia to either respond positively or further entrench itself as the obdurate belligerent. Was this summit some kind of beginning of the end? What did Ukrainians think of their president suggesting that there is anything to talk about? And what has to happen in any war to create a momentum for peace? This is the Foreign Desk.
In our post-Soviet space, intangibles in negotiations like respect, authority, power matters more than actual direct costs. So therefore, for Russia, for instance, they easily can sustain costs from sanctions, whereas they see that the intangibles are being met, like respect out of fear and other stuff.
People were really nervous, like, oh man, this is going to be a loss for Ukraine, that it's going to make Ukraine look bad. It's going to sort of reveal the truth that support is weakening for Ukraine. And I think people were surprised by the imagery, actually, of all of these countries sitting around this giant table there for Ukraine.
Somehow you need a conflict to get to a stage where both parties find the costs to be exceeding the possible gains. And I'm skeptical to the idea that peace falls out of the sky. I think peace processes, for them to work, normally takes a long time, needs careful thinking, careful preparation, careful strategy.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. I'm joined first of all by Iuliia Osmolovska, former Ukrainian diplomat, expert on negotiation and currently director of Globsec Ukraine in Kyiv. She joins me here in the studio. I want to start by asking about a phrase which President Zelensky kept using at the summit, which was the idea of a just and lasting peace. Does that to you imply that he is thinking about some kind of negotiated end to this war with Russia?
It definitely should be negotiations at the end. It doesn't mean that Ukraine is going to concede on something or to give some concessions to Russia, but even if Russia capitulates, these are negotiations. So basically after Second World War, the final settlement, this is negotiation. So basically when he says about just and lasting peace, that means that the Ukrainian side has to take this as a fair solution, and it should be justifiable according to international norms and standards and international law. Therefore, for us, it is important, actually, to have this fair solution.
You mentioned the example of World War II, but obviously those negotiations, such as they were with countries like Germany and Japan, were with countries which had been destroyed, shattered and conquered, which it's very unlikely Russia is going to be. So that being the case, do you think it is imaginable that Russia would ever agree to anything that does not include Ukrainian territorial concessions?
Yes, we shouldn't exclude that because we're talking about the current political leadership of Russia, but the situation is not stable, so it could be different in a year time or two, and some new team might come in with a different perception, or there might be some developments that also force Russia to change their view. However, just on the eve of this conference, it was very interesting that Putin actually again restated his initial vision of how this peace should be looked like, and they're ready to actually come to some sort of settlement settlement, and this he is not recalibrating his initial goals. This is important. And when the Prime Minister of Netherlands is saying that this is a sign that Putin is panicking, I disagree.
I did want to ask you about Putin's statement on the eve of the summit, in which he did put out what I think he tried to pitch as his own vision for peace, possibly somewhat disingenuously, but that was a very maximalist demand. He is demanding, in fact, that Russia be ceded territories it hasn't even yet conquered. Yeah. Did that strike you as what he actually thinks is going to happen, or was he perhaps doing that thing that you often do at the start of a negotiation? You stake out a maximalist claim and you understand that you're going to have to climb down from it.
No, basically, for me, I'm a professional negotiator. So these statements just the proof of the Russians' normal lie they usually take. But this is also the sign that they're not actually into real negotiations at the moment, because they understand that this is non-conceivable. So this is not going to happen. Their demands, they're not going to be met. This is why it is an indication that he is determined to pursue his unilateral course of continuing with this military aggression in Ukraine in anticipation that he could achieve his goals unilaterally.
You've written before about the peculiar difficulties of trying to negotiate with Russia. You mentioned something called the Kremlin matrix of negotiations. And it reminded me of something I've discussed this a few times over the last couple of years, usually with politicians who've grown up and lived and worked very close to Russia, geographically speaking. And they keep insisting that the mistake that Western Europeans keep making is assuming that Russians essentially think like Europeans. And it is their contention that that is not the case. Is that what you think as well?
Yes, of course. I could tell you that for us, for post-Soviet mentality, it's much easier to understand and anticipate the actions of our Western partners, because your decision-making is actually based on the theory of rational choice. So if you see something beneficial, you're into it. Whereas in our post-Soviet space, it's rather about some kind of irrationality from your eyes, how we take decisions, because for us intangibles in negotiations like respect, authority, power matters more than actual direct costs. So therefore for Russia, for instance, they easily can sustain costs from sanctions, whereas they see that the intangibles are being met, like respect out of fear and other stuff. Therefore, I keep insisting that if we want to push Russia in the corner, we really need to pursue with this type of strategy of isolating Russia. And this is what about exactly this peace summit was.
Why do you think, though, Russia has not yet had what I guess you might think of as that moment of humility? I mean, I know people make the comparisons with Germany and Japan, but as we were saying earlier, those situations after World War II were very different, and it's very unlikely that will be replicated. But even if you think back a few centuries in European history, I mean, Lithuania was a grand duchy at one point. Its territory comprised huge chunks of what is now Poland and Ukraine. But if any Lithuanian politician stood up now and said, we must take it all back, people would assume they were having some sort of episode.
Yes, because they've been living already in a different type of civilization, let it called developed democracy. Whereas Russia still has this old-fashioned thinking of a great empire. And it's also important to highlight to our Western partners that we shouldn't be talking about any kind of peace settlement or ceasefire, because this is the pause and invitation for further invasion. Because, for psychological reasons, for Russia, they've already been humiliated in Ukraine. And been humiliated because they didn't achieve their goals in 3 days like they wanted. And because West stood on the side of Ukraine. So basically, it's not just about humiliating Ukraine, revenging Ukraine for this humiliation, but actually revenging the whole West who stood behind Ukraine for this humiliation of Russia.
But do you think to get to a point where constructive negotiations are possible, Russia still needs to be humiliated or beaten further? Because you're right to point out that Russia has not accomplished what it wanted to or what it thought it was going to. But it's also, you could see that Vladimir Putin could turn around to the Russian people now and call this a win. So does Russia need to suffer further losses on the battlefield before there is any point in talking to them?
I think this is not the only one factor that should play into a final conclusion of decision-making, which strategy to take. There could be plenty of internal factors within the inner circle of Putin and other outer developments that could contribute into this decision. So it's not just the losses on the battlefield, definitely. But because Russia is playing these power games, in power games, it's always the competitor actually has to suffer and to lose before he admits that he needs to do something differently. So this is why we have no illusions that Russia should be defeated on the battlefield. And then it could be possible to get into some kind of meaningful negotiations on Ukrainian terms. Fair, lasting peace based on international law.
So, thinking as a professional negotiator then, what did you make of the framework that was put together at the summit? The idea that Ukraine and its allies will pursue three particular avenues. These were nuclear security, food security, the repatriation of people taken prisoner in one way or another. The idea being that, not even Russia is going to disagree with these as a good idea. Even if Russia won't cooperate, and Russia usually doesn't, is this still constructive? Do you see this as progress?
I think this is a brilliant strategy by the Ukrainian government, because let me remind your listeners that when the war started, we started with these negotiations, bilateral negotiations with Russia, where they demanded that they should be among the guarantor states for Ukraine's security and put all these demands like Ukraine is not going to apply for NATO membership and so on. So it was very difficult for us to pursue our position. So the reverse of these negotiations, the consequence of steps should be different one. So Ukraine should have been aggregating this negotiation power first. And this is something exactly what they've done with this Peace Formula Summit. If you can watch this, look at this family photo at the end of the summit. It is quite impressive in terms of number of peoples and the number of countries shown up. And picking up the less controversial issues to which a lot of countries might align to, like the one that you mentioned, this was a very smart step to get as many countries on board as possible. And because the government of Ukraine said that it's an open declaration, so any other country could join it, and it's something based on international law and United Nations Charter. So definitely this is the room for more and more countries getting in. It's just the matter of negotiations with each particular country, and this takes time.
Iuliia Osmolovska, Director of GlobeSec Ukraine, thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. This is the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Now for a look back at last weekend's summit as seen by your correspondent. The 2024 Ukraine Peace Summit isn't in Ukraine and isn't terrifically likely in and of itself to bring peace. It is, at least on a summit, specifically that of the Bergenstock, a handsome mountain overlooking Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. Atop the Bergenstock is the Bergenstock Resort. Remote, picturesque and relatively easy to secure, it has hosted big diplomatic events and big diplomatic wigs before. 3 Bilderberg conferences, that semi-furtive annual conclave of the powerful, have been held here, as has one inconclusive summit on Cyprus. Other guests have included Hafez al-Assad, Konrad Adenauer and Jawaharlal Nehru. Less consequentially, but more glamorously, Sophia Loren and Audrey Hepburn both lived here for a bit. Getting up here this particular weekend, at least for those of us who didn't bring our own helicopters, is not a straightforward undertaking. Media have to meet a shuttle bus from the nearby town of Stans, possibly, who knows, founded like Rome by 2 wolf-raised brothers, though both called Stan. One big bus takes us up one of Switzerland's more winding roads to an improvised media accreditation centre at Obergen. Once in receipt of laminates and lanyards, smaller buses take us up the roads on which the big bus wouldn't fit. The rolling green meadows en route are settled intermittently by temporary military and police outposts. Your correspondent is spending most of his weekend in the media centre, a cement-ceilinged bunker with frosted-out windows just a couple of 100 metres away from where the political action is, although given the security arrangements and the strictly delineated levels of access designated by our badges and laminates, we mostly might as well be in orbit. Big screens in the media centre show the incoming motorcades and disembarkation of the principals at the entrance to the bit of the resort where anything interesting is occurring. Some earnest film crews film the screens, less earnest journalists photograph the film crews filming the screens. The first instance of the last refuge of the despondent journalist, i.e. interviewing other journalists, is witnessed before lunch on day 1. There is some extremely limited interaction with those who have come here to shape the fate of nations and so forth. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine appears in the media centre on the first day alongside his host and Swiss counterpart Viola Amherd.
At the second peace summit, we can fix the real end of the war. Now we are starting this path together. Thank you for participating in the summit. I hope for fruitful work together, of course, together.
He speaks in English for about 10 minutes and doesn't take any questions. It is quite difficult not to feel sorry for him at this point, a man who has an unarguable case, i.e. that his country has been invaded and terrorised for no good reason at all, but is still having to find new ways to make it so that the world's attention does not drift any further. Intermittently, there are invitations to escape briefly from the media corral and go outdoors and join a press line for some panjandrum or other, perchance to bark an incoherent question and receive a non-committal answer while swatting aside television cameras and getting elbowed in the ribs by photographers. In general, we hear about these between 10 and 20 minutes after they've already happened. Your correspondent does manage to wangle a place in the gaggle to greet President Emmanuel Macron of France. He keeps us waiting for 45 minutes, honestly, who does he think he is, before breezing cheerfully past without stopping. One desperate hack bellows at him in English, "Mr. President, do you feel the spirit of Bergenstock?" Possibly he's on a commission from the proprietors. Macron replies, grinning and without breaking stride, "Yes, I do." The laughter from the French media contingent as Macron disappears has an unsurprised tone to it. He does this kind of thing, I am reliably, if wearily informed, pretty frequently. We have a bit more luck on day 2. There is a joint press call in the media centre comprising Zelensky, Amherd, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo, Chilean President Gabriel Boric, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. They all say what you'd reckon they would, pretty much, and don't take questions.
Only adherence to international law and the protection of human rights can ensure peace. This summit and these convictions are not about NATO. This is about respect of international law and human rights as foundational principles of our living together.
However, Zelensky returns alone for a sort of curtain call and does take questions, and it's a reminder that above and beyond his place at the centre of a great crisis, he is one of the great natural communicators, punchy, pointed, just occasionally as droll as his dreadful circumstances permit. Catering is served in bowls constructed from recycled plant waste, which contain not yet recycled plant waste. On the first evening, as we peck at dinner in the cafe, a quartet of 4 young women are shepherded through. They are clad from head to foot in white lace, their faces painted a matching hue, clearly part of some sort of entertainment being laid on for the VIPs. Whether or not they were actually lashed to a marble altar while the rulers of the world capered naked around a giant burning owl, I cannot confirm, but I didn't see them again. While there were not many media opportunities at the conference, as underlined there, I did manage to speak to Australia's emissary, the Minister for Government Services and former opposition leader Bill Shorten. Here's some of what he had to say about what the actual discussions between officials had been like.
I have to say I'm incredibly impressed. I've always wondered if the whole of Europe would go the distance with Ukraine. I understand why the Poles and Moldova and the Baltics would, and Finland, but I'm very impressed by the depth of commitment to Ukraine. What was also impressive was the buy-in from countries outside of Europe. The fact is, Ghana and Kenya, Argentina and Chile, really important that Turkey was there. Indonesia, India sent observers, Japan, Korea, I guess ourselves and our Kiwi brothers and sisters. I was impressed by the depth of resolve and the core issue being, and I think the Singaporean Senior Minister put it best to me, this is about territorial sovereignty. And I won't put words in her mouth, but it was about, for nations, we accept that we've have the rule of law, and what that means practically is big countries can't invade small countries, annex, invade, rape, murder, and that there's a recognition amongst countries who don't like each other that this is a red line.
Have you been surprised, therefore, by how much agreement there has actually been among 100, well, I think President Boric from Chile just put it quite well, countries which may not agree on many other things but can at least agree on this?
Yeah, I was heartened actually, and I thought the issues that were raised of specific nature were smart. Nuclear safety, that seems to be something which the world can sign up to. Returning kids, that seems to be an unexceptionable basic human condition. Food security, making sure that there's freedom of navigation so Ukrainian grain can feed Africa. I don't know what I expected, but I was heartened to see the depth of what I saw.
That was Bill Shorten, Australia's Minister for Government Services and former opposition leader, speaking to me at the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland last weekend. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. I'm joined now here in the studio by Lili Bivings, business editor of the Kyiv Independent, who was also at the Bergenstock last weekend. Lili, first of all, your general impressions. What did you make of the summit? Did it surprise you in any way?
Actually, yeah. I was surprised at the turnout. Honestly, in the days leading up to it, there was a lot of fear that countries were dropping out, that they weren't going to show up, that China and Russia were doing everything they could to sabotage it, to call it a failure before it had even started. And so there was just a lot of anxiety that Ukraine had kind of hyped up this big event that was going to be really anticlimactic. In the end, you have Saudi Arabia show up, which is a pretty big deal, and you have like 92 countries showing up just to show their support for Ukraine. I mean, it's a big deal.
As far as it is possible to tell, how has it gone over in Ukraine? Was there a similar trajectory in Ukraine, do you think, of people thinking this might be kind of a bust and then being pleasantly surprised that it actually turned out to be quite impressive?
Yeah, I think that was actually exactly what it was, because there was so much news in Ukraine especially that China and Russia were doing all of these things to make it look bad before it had even started. And so people were really nervous, like, oh man, this is going to be a loss for Ukraine, that it's going to make Ukraine look bad. It's going to sort of reveal the truth that countries are kind of, their support is weakening for Ukraine. And I think people were really, surprised by the imagery, actually, of like all of these countries sitting around this giant table there for Ukraine, which is a striking difference from Minsk I and Minsk II back in 2015, 2016, when you had like a few people around a table.
Because I did want to ask about the spectacle, and in retrospect in particular, does it seem like that was important to Ukraine and to President Zelensky as well, that he wasn't just having to say that we have the support of a lot of the world, look, they're all actually here?
Yeah, I think just the fact that you have these images there, it makes it hard for Russia to say that these countries don't support Ukraine, for example, right, or China even, because, look, they actually did show up. They are there. They clearly support Ukraine in some respect, and of course to varying degrees, right? But they showed up. They all came on their helicopters to Switzerland to at least like sit around that table, even if they didn't do or say much or even sign the joint communique at the end, right? They still showed up.
What was also interesting, I thought, was the fact that Ukraine did put forward these 3 tracks for potential negotiation or discussion with Russia about food security, nuclear security, repatriation of captives of various kinds. Was that well received in Ukraine? Or I'm wondering, did it cause any nervousness among people thinking, hang on, are we talking about talking to Russia? Because for the last 2 years and a bit, the line has been there is nothing to talk about until Russia packs up and goes home.
I think people actually thought it was really smart. People in Ukraine understand that this peace summit was not going to bring any of us closer to peace with Russia. Not today, not tomorrow, not in a year, not for many years probably. But they understood it to be what I think it was, which was this showing of support for Ukraine. And they understood that the Ukrainian side needed to bring some things to the table that everybody could agree with. Right? Like everyone can agree with the fact that prisoners of war and civilians should be exchanged, should not be kept in captivity, especially in places that are not following the Geneva Conventions. Food should be exported, and that nuclear safety is extremely important for the world, especially in that part of the world where you've already had a tragedy in the past. So I think people were like, okay, this is pretty clever, right? Bring a bunch of things to the table that everybody has to agree with, or if you don't, you're a bit kind of weird or strange, right, for not agreeing with the basic things. So I think people, by and large, thought that that was an intelligent move of diplomacy. I didn't see people complaining about that part, although you did see people kind of saying like, well, okay, well, what does this do? How does this actually end the war? How does this actually bring peace?
Leaving aside grumbles of that kind, do you think there fundamentally is still majority trust in President Zelensky in Ukraine?
I think it depends on the issue. The short answer is yes. If we're talking about domestic issues or some domestic policies, there's probably a bit less. There's more skepticism. There's kind of more criticism. If we're talking about what he's done for Ukraine on the global stage and what he and his team managed to organize internationally and the attention that they get internationally, I think most people would have to concede that he's doing a pretty good job there, right? Like the world pays a lot of attention to Ukraine still. All of the major news outlets, at least in the West, want to do interviews with Zelensky. People are showing up to these events, and it's undeniable that he and his team have managed to keep the attention on Ukraine on the global stage. So I think people are happy with that side. Do they love him, internally all the time? No, because things are not going super well in Ukraine just by nature of the fact that there's a war going on now for almost 3 years.
Is there any resentment of Zelensky in particular, or I guess his government in general, attached to the increasingly hard line that they are taking on young men, or indeed not even just young men, but men up to quite an advanced age who haven't yet served?
Yeah, I think that it's not a resentment towards Zelensky necessarily, although of course he is the president, so he gets blamed for all the country's problems, right? But I think people are frustrated with the government about the kind of random nature of this conscription, right? And especially for businesses, they're very anxious because they don't know how many of their employees or how many people they are able to reserve and then how many people will get mobilized. There's also kind of some practices, right, of conscription officers just standing in the metro and pulling people off the street, or even standing at the entrance of workplaces and taking people. And I think a lot of businesses, everyone's kind of feeling like, well, what I do is really important. Like, I export steel, so you should mobilize less of my people. Or we're an energy company, so you should have us reserve more of our people. And then you have some stuff that's a bit unfair, right? Like state-owned companies, a lot of times 100% of their employees are reserved, which means they can't be mobilized. So 100% of Naftagaz, which is a state-owned energy company, none of their employees can get mobilized. But a privately owned energy company, they get maybe 70 or 80% of their employees are reserved and can't be mobilized. So there's just some sort of there's some inequality going on, and I think that frustrates people. Whether or not they think that that's Zelensky's fault and they resent him for it, I don't know if it's him personally. I think they resent the war in Russia and the lack of coherent policy sometimes in Ukraine that is just sort of a feature of Ukrainian society still, as it's still a developing country.
But to bring everything back to the summit and to the idea that Zelensky floated that he was willing to talk, or not directly to Russia, but at least interact with Russia on an extremely limited range of issues, do you think he's perhaps testing the limits of what Ukraine's people would tolerate in terms of reaching a settlement with Russia? Because it would be very difficult for him, I guess, after 2 years and more of full-scale war in which tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed, injured, millions displaced, to actually even talk about potentially assigning any Ukrainian territory to Russia as part of a settlement.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point that there's speculation that they're testing the waters to see what the reaction is. And actually, in some polls, you see that Ukrainians are very, very slowly kind of softening their position and feel like, well, maybe we could give something up if it would just end this war, right? Because this war is just so brutal and people want it to be over. It's also, I think, a way of showing the world that the Ukrainian side is interested in diplomacy, to sort of highlight how the Russian side is not interested in diplomacy, clearly, right? Because there's this contrast that maybe Putin will say that he's interested in it, but then look at his actions, right? So I think Ukraine is also trying to make sure that the world understands that it does want to play a serious diplomatic game, and that it's thinking about that, and that it's not rejecting those ideas, that it can come to the table and talk to Russia or to Putin. But I think it's a bit more strategy than it is reality. I don't think either side is really actually ready to talk to each other, at least officially yet. Because, of course, when you have both sides saying you need to take your troops out before we have any conversations, it's like, well, okay. So yeah, I think Zelensky just kind of wants to see how everybody feels about comments like that, but also just make himself look like a professional, mature statesman.
Lili Bivings, business editor of the Kyiv Independent, thank you for joining us. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio, and I'm joined finally by Kristian Berg Harpviken, research professor and former director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo. Kristian has also just been named the new director of the Nobel Institute, starting from next year. Kristian, we'll start with a very general question. Wars rarely stop on day two, unfortunately. So at what point in a conflict do you start to see signs that maybe there might be an opportunity to think about peace and how peace might work? What needs to have happened first?
Well, the real challenge is that all wars have at least two parties. And for a war to come to an end through a negotiated solution, both parties have to feel that there is a stalemate and that if they look into the future, they are only going to lose out further, that the costs are going to increase, what conflict resolution researchers often refer to as a ripe moment. But not only that, the parties also need to be convinced that it is actually possible to get to a solution through mediation. So the bar for getting into really tangible peace negotiations is quite high.
Is there a way you can nudge people towards that? Can people be persuaded or pushed towards believing or perceiving that they are caught in a stalemate that they cannot possibly win militarily?
To some extent, but I think the military logic is really speaking quite loudly here. And I think what happens on the battlefield is really decisive for whether the parties think that the negotiations ought to be engaged in. What I think is easier to nudge people towards is the conviction that a negotiated solution to the conflict is possible. So in other words, when the parties feel that military progress has stalled and that the costs are becoming unacceptably high, if they at that moment still don't see that a negotiated solution is possible, you may, if you are engaging them in, say, issue-specific negotiations, in just confidence-building types of activities, over time get to the point where they think that they can actually engage in talks, perhaps even that they start to trust the other party's intentions of doing the same.
As part of that process, can international pressure make a difference, especially when it is a state-on-state conflict? And that's clearly part of what President Zelensky was trying to orchestrate at Switzerland last weekend by gathering 92 or so heads of state and or government in one place and having most of them come down fairly heavily on his side.
Oh, absolutely. International support matters a great deal. And if we look around the world and look at today's conflicts, there are very few conflicts in which international support doesn't play a major role. Now, when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, the Ukrainians have felt this both ways because, as you alluded to, Zelensky has been very clever at rallying international support, particularly in the West, and he's been quite successful. But we also realized that there was a 6-month interlude in which US support was not forthcoming, and that manifested itself directly in Ukrainian progress on the battlefield stalling, and Ukraine to some extent being on the defensive, at least for a period. Now that seems to have come to a halt, but it definitely did also impact Ukraine's position diplomatically.
It does often become the case with conflicts, and again, especially state-on-state conflicts, that it tends to end up being framed in the media and the popular imagination as a struggle of wills between the two respective leaders. And that's certainly been the case in Ukraine and Russia, Volodymyr Zelensky versus Vladimir Putin. There have been plenty of examples in history where the war leader has turned peacemaker. How important is having the right combination of individuals in leadership positions at exactly the right moment?
I think having the right leaders at the right moment is very important. And if you look at Ukraine, the way that Ukraine has been able to mobilize for its defense, I think is virtually unimaginable under a different leader. Zelensky himself as a person has been extremely important. Now, Putin is, of course, also an extremely strong leader and somebody who doesn't cultivate any crown prince of any sort. It is hard, I have to admit, in the current situation to see a sustainable peace being concluded between the two leaders that are currently at the head of politics in Ukraine and Russia. And I think the best hope for a comprehensive, peaceful solution to this conflict lies in a change of government on the Russian side.
Is it usually the case that a sticking point is that somebody somewhere has to be prepared to be generous towards the people they've been fighting a war against? In this particular instance, obviously, there was a lot of perhaps optimistic talk early on about giving Russia some sort of off-ramp or some means of avoiding total war and then avoiding total defeat. One also thinks of Colombia, where the first time that the peace proposal with the FARC there was put to the people, it was rejected at a referendum, largely because people, I think, thought, why should we be generous to these people who've spent half a century trying to kill us?
Yes, there is also a grain of truth in that, but being generous to one's adversary may also have to do with rational thinking and self-interest. And I think in the Colombian case, although ultimately generosity seems to have won out, I mean, throughout the whole peace negotiation process, both parties were very clear that the military battle had to continue. They tried to separate the military efforts from what happened at the negotiation table. But clearly, there were also instances where, in fact, the dynamics of the negotiations were intentionally manipulated by what one did on the battlefield. And, you know, in the Ukraine case, we saw this now in the run-up to the meeting in Switzerland, that Russia in particular was trying to send signals to the talks in Switzerland by upping the ante in eastern Ukraine.
And just as a final thought, and trying to prize some optimism out of this, have you ever been personally surprised by peace descending on a particular conflict from a clear blue sky, or is it always something of an attritional grind before everybody is willing to talk to each other?
Well, I do think that somehow you need a conflict to get to a stage where both parties find the costs to be exceeding the possible gains and want to find a political solution. And I'm skeptical to the idea that peace falls out of the sky. I think peace processes, for them to work, normally takes a long time, needs careful thinking, careful preparation, careful strategy. The Colombian example is a very clear case of that. It took 6 years. Both parties worked very meticulously on their file in advance of every single meeting. The Afghan case, another case I'm deeply familiar with, is exactly the opposite. There, it was so important for the US to get a deal concluded overnight that one ended up with the worst possible deal imaginable.
Kristian Berg, Harpviken, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.